We did look at a long-term data on how actual temperature and precipitation has changed over the last 60 years or so. We used a lot of that information to better understand how changes in temperature and precip were impacting corn and soybean yield trends over the last 30 or 40 years. Overall, the trends that we found across the state of Wisconsin for temperature was that the most significant warming trends were occurring during winter and springtime and at nighttime, and that there are large portions of the state that have seen trends towards a very large decrease in the frequency of very cold nights or below zero. So overall, while we've seen quite a bit of warming, most of it is focused during the wintertime and during nighttime. We generally saw that about 30% of the year-to-year variation in yields were contributed to those trends in climate on a county-by-county basis, which is a pretty large, I guess, percentage of what you would expect to see. Those trends have also contributed to a trend towards earlier springtime planting of corn in particular, to the point that we plant corn about 10 days earlier now than we did about 40 years ago. And we know that for every extra day of earlier planting, that usually equals about an increase of 1 to 3 bushels per acre in corn yield at the end of the season. So it's been a pretty significant contribution, not only here in Wisconsin, but across the Midwest in yield trends since the 1970s. Looking forward, as temperature patterns change and precipitation patterns change, Wisconsin happens to lie in a climate regime that has a very significant gradient in terms of the types of hybrids for corn that we can plant from the south to north. So we're not like other southern corn belt states like Iowa and Illinois, where they generally plant the latest maturing crop types or hybrids, longest season varieties. We can go from a long season variety in the south all the way to a very, very short season variety up in the north. And that span creates quite a large gradient in the yield that we get from those crops. So it's a little bit uncertain, but we could turn out to be more like a state like Iowa or Illinois in 50 years when it comes to a more consistent array of hybrids that are planted. And it's important just to keep track of the changes as they go along. Well, they're basically always trying to take advantage of the long growing season. So they generally just have a longer frost-free period. They generally don't have to deal with a lot of what we would call late spring frost that could damage crops after they've come out of the ground, which is something we do have to be concerned about here in Wisconsin. It really comes down to planting hybrids and genotypes that are best suited for that warmer climate, so you don't get into a situation where you're planting shorter season varieties that aren't taking advantage of the length of the growing season. Another potential problem is having more pests over winter that generally might be relegated further south where they're basically able to survive winters. Those might gradually shift northward and migrate as our winters become warmer. So that could create another management issue for farmers and growers in the region that they don't have to deal with right now. I mean, they do have to deal with pests, but not necessarily all the ones that could be coming into the region. I guess some examples would be soybean aphid, which actually was first discovered in Wisconsin around the year 2000 or 2001. Since then, farmers have come up with ways to manage that pest by knowing a threshold at which they need to spray and act on. Things like European corn borer. I'm not going to remember all the names of them, but some of these could be found as far south as the Gulf Coast. And I don't know if those would eventually migrate all the way up here or not, but things that are found in Missouri, southern Illinois, Kentucky area, southern Iowa are definitely fair game in the next few decades. The weed problem could be pretty significant because weeds generally react just like any other plant in terms of how their phenology or their biological stages of growth could change. If we see warming in springtime, farmers may have to adjust the way they go about and spray before they have emergence taking place, or even before they have things planted in the ground. So it's a really big problem because the other issue is that with a variety of weeds that are found in the seed bank and the soils, there are different weeds that come up at different times of the year, and it's already a management mess. Changes in climate will only create more chaos, I guess, to that management problem. And generally a lot of the crop types too are C3 crops, which means they will react more strongly to increases in atmospheric CO2. Corn, being a C4 plant, isn't going to respond as much to increases in CO2, so there might be a competitive edge given to weeds in the future, unfortunately, as atmospheric CO2 goes up also. I think probably all starts with data collection on the farm and keeping good records. I mean, large-scale operators already do this. They know what hybrids they're planting, they know when they planted them, when they harvested them. They keep all that type of information. But a part-time farmer or someone who's maybe not as technologically advanced or isn't able to afford those types of electronic management tools, handwritten records kept, those will be very valuable, moving forward, to try to piece together like, okay, this did well this year, it didn't do well this year. For most of our traditional crops, it's really understanding how climate has changed in a way to affect your growing season length, as well as the number of growing degree days that you have available in a season. You want to make sure that you're planting the hybrid that's best suited for your region based on the recent weather and climate, and that might mean just the last 5 or 10 years rather than the last 30 or 40. And I think crop consultants and seed companies are kind of on top of these things already and making sure that people get what they're supposed to have. The second thing would be adjusting planting dates to the point where you're not planting so early that you end up with plant emergence and then a killing frost, which is generally what happened in 2012 around here with the 80-degree weather we had in March. Things went into full bloom, and then we had killing freezes after that. So we're kind of in a tough spot. There will always be a tendency of people wanting to get things in the ground early, but there's a risk that's associated with that.